Hey, everybody. Good afternoon. Hey, Roy. How you doing?
Hey, James. Good to see you.
Hope you guys are all doing well. If you're tuning in, or whenever you tune in, hope that you're doing well. So, welcome back to our live stream. We're going to be talking today about our conversation on flourishing that we had started last week. We're going to be putting it into the context and framework of discipleship. And so we'll get to that in a minute. But first, just wanted to ask you to be praying for us for something. May is a big fundraising month for us, as it is for a lot of nonprofits in Lincoln. I'm sure it is for a lot of nonprofits around the country. But we are in the midst of a kind of a fundraising campaign to raise money for our Families Together program, our preventative program. And also, we fundraise to help supplement with foster care costs. So we have sent out thousands, 2,500 letters, emails, Facebook posts, Instagram posts, all that kind of stuff, asking people to consider partnering with us financially. So huge prayer requests. If you're watching or listening, we just pray that God would provide for what we do. Our ministry, like so many others, depends on the generosity of people like you and others who want to be a part of what God is doing. So we just ask your prayers. Right, I don't know if you want to say anything about that, but want to make sure to let people know May's a big month and we're trusting the Lord for big things.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is if you haven't received a letter from us, I mean, I would say, hey, we'd love to make sure that we have your contact information and love to share with you all of the amazing things that God is doing in our midst, whether that's directly in foster care or that's through our Beyond Prison or Families Together program. There's a lot of amazing things happening. And so obviously we need financial partners to partner with us so we can continue to not just support our current things. You and I talked about, before, we went live is, I think some people arrive at the wrong conclusion that because we're state funded through foster care, that somehow that funding is enough. It usually is never enough for the services that we provide families. And so obviously even supplementing the work that we currently do in foster care is important, but Families Together is completely non-funded by any contract. It is through private donations and foundations and grants that we go after. And so your financial support is huge so we can continue to help and care for vulnerable children in Lincoln and Omaha.
Great. Yeah. So thanks for praying for that and for considering it. We'd love to get your information, even if you're not interested in giving. We have a monthly newsletter. We'd love to get you on that list. And so you could just DM us on any platform you're listening to, and we'd love to get you on our newsletter. Well, let's talk about flourishing. We started it last week. Today, we're talking about it in the context of discipleship. We have a couple slides that we're going to share from that same Barna presentation that we had mentioned a couple weeks ago that really talks about the positive influence of religious communities on families. Last week, if you remember, Roy, we talked about kind of the negative things that a religious community keeps people from. Well, today we're going to talk about the positive side of it. Yeah. So maybe just start with kind of your heart. If you guys don't know Roy, Roy used to work for Focus on the Family. He's been the director at a Christian camp. And so your whole ministry life has been interwoven with discipleship and families. And so just maybe talk about your heart for that and where kind of you want to go in this conversation today.
Well, yeah, when we'll look at data, we'll look at some data points around flourishing, but I think in the context of, for us being a faith-based organization and we think about human flourishing, I think it has to come into the context of what is God's design for every family, because we can make the argument, and we've talked about this before, every family is vulnerable. All of us navigate vulnerabilities. It could be a doctor's visit. It could be, that email or that we just know in an instant things can radically change for the family. And obviously in foster care and the work that we do with vulnerable children, we see all kinds of different ways that where a family was stable one day and a heartbeat that can change. And that's, obviously there's those kinds of things, but there's even within poverty and a lot of the different things that are threats against families. But the reality is all of us, even for myself, for you, James, you have 4 kids. I have 3 kids, 2 are now in college. One's out of college, one's in college, one in high school, but every day I'm navigating, what does it mean for me as a believer to be a good parent, if I could use, good, if I could quantify that. And the call for us is to be we are disciplers of our children. And so I wanted to share a couple thoughts as we think about flourishing. It's not just about these one or two things that we're talking about. I think as believers, there's a much larger goal. So if you haven't, one of the books I love is a book by Chap Bettis that's called The Disciple Making Parent. It's a great resource, I think, for any Christian home and family who want to be really intentional about what it means to be that. So I think if I could just share a couple of quotes, because I think one of the things that's going to be really important in that is then this will help define flourishing and what we're after as an organization that comes alongside hurting and vulnerable families. So here's a couple things that Chap says. I love this. We discipline our children not so they will make us happy, but so that they will serve Christ as adults. We educate them so they can have a good job, but to develop them to be the best followers of Jesus they can be. I love this. He says, we work hard to prepare them not for graduation day, but for judgment day. I love this one. The first battleground of family discipleship is not my child's heart, is my heart, right? Think of Deuteronomy. Yeah. Think about Deuteronomy 6, right? Each parent must decide whether he is more concerned that his child is accepted into heaven or Harvard, right? I love this. He says, having made the point that there are no guarantees, we must also make the counterpoint equally strong. God can and does use means. Because there is no guarantee of success does not give me the right to throw up my hands. A belief in God's providence and promises does not give me a license to live passively. It's just filled with a lot of great nuggets of really, I think, so if I want my children to flourish, if I want my children to thrive, whether they are my children or even like a host home or foster family, what we do, we need to understand that there are outcomes by simply doing it God's way, that there should be better outcomes in our children because we do it God's way. And again, there are no guarantees. There's threats against that every day. But if I am only concerned about my kid getting into the right school, but I'm not concerned about what his ultimate eternity looks like, at some level, my children are not going to flourish. Yep. So as a believer, I need to understand that. And so I think as we talk about this, I want to cast that large umbrella over for us as Christian Heritage, why the work we do is so important. And I think what differentiates us from any other organization here in Nebraska is how we can best mobilize God's people to care for kids.
Yeah, no, that's really good. And I even think, I've learned so much about trauma from working for Christian Heritage. Of course, for those of you who don't know me, before I was a pastor, I worked in child protection services. Then my wife and I were foster parents. So I have baseline level of understanding, but a lot of the families that we work with, they come from generational poverty, yep, generational abuse or neglect, typically not in a faith community. And so they lack a lot of those resources that you just talked about that parents have. And yet, as we mentioned last week, if a church or individuals in a church want to support people who've suffered trauma, but they don't recognize their own trauma, they don't recognize their own deficiencies, they'll do a lot more harm than good. And so that's why when you see it can get really messy when the church gets involved. And so, we want to help vulnerable families, but a part of our heart at Christian Heritage is how do we also help the church? How do we help Christians grow in understanding their own trauma and then walking with Jesus faithfully in the midst of all that?
Because then for me, right, and we talked about this last week, so at every level now, we are actually fulfilling the Great Commission at every level. And imagine when we're able to open up our hearts and homes in such a way that allows us to live out that Great Commission by making disciples. But as parents, we need to understand that our first mission field is our own homes and the ways that the outcomes that we want to see. And again, the research that we'll look at is kids who are raised in Christian homes have an advantage, from a mental health and well-being. And again, that's a broad statement,
Sure.
because I think there's a lot of threats against that. And there's lots of threats. And again, there's no guarantee. So I could do all the right things and still might not, I still might have children that suffer. So there's not if I do this, I get this.
Yeah.
But there are protective factors that come with and should manifest itself by those parents who are super concerned about, having a kingdom perspective about how they run and conduct their homes, the relationships that they have with their kids. Yeah. And that's just super important.
Great. Well, so we'll share these slides here and kind of just walk through them. There's just a couple of them. We got 3, I think, but this first one talks about the effect that religious communities have on families. And they talk about these 4 different domains. Again, this actually in particular is coming from the Journal of Positive Psychology and Well-Being. Don't let that trip you up if you're not into positive psychology.
Right.
But really, what it's getting at is for people who are in religious communities, their families experience higher levels of forgiveness, thankfulness, acts of kindness, and volunteering. And we'll see that on the next few slides. And they have some definitions, and I'm not going to read those to you. But really what I see here, Roy, is when you're involved in religious community, there is outcomes that exhibit the fruit of the Spirit, which
Absolutely.
is getting at the heart of what you're talking about.
Really well said.
With what you were just saying. I'm just blanking on the word, so I'll let you go. Oh, discipleship, of course.
Right, discipleship.
Pastor guy, discipleship. Yeah. What is discipleship? I experience and live out the fruit of the Spirit. That's discipleship. And so you see that here.
Right. And so these aspects of flourishing. So we think about this then from a disciple. When we think about this is why this is so important, because discipleship gets at the heart of how am I modeling this then for my children?
Yep.
And the data will show this. The research will show that it's not simply about, hey, did you read your Bible today? It's not about information. It's not just about information. It's not just about concepts. It's for me as a parent to be able to model. So let's tackle that first one, forgiveness. My children need to see me actively work out these aspects of forgiveness, whether that's in my home or outside of my home. They need to see me not just, hey, this is important. Hey, we learned this in church today. It is when there's friction or tension in my home or when there's, conflict, how do we resolve that in our families of origin? So forgiveness is a critical part to well-being, which again, if anyone should own the market, if I could say it that way, on forgiveness, it's Christian churches, it's Christian homes. So we should be the model for how to do it and do it best.
And you see our children see that. In each one of these, in the highlighted red font, decreased depression, decreased anxiety, increased hope, more connected, more engaged, less anxious. Again, there's not a magic pill. It's not it's not like some kind of secret sauce and where it's, all your problem. I mean, even Ted Bundy's parents were loving Christian parents, right? Like, I'm not saying, oh, my kid's going to be a serial killer, but this is not, it's not, oh, I do this and I'll get this. That's not what we're saying, but it's the increased likelihood that children will flourish, that by the time they're an adult, what you deposit into them more than likely will come out. It's a generality. That's really what the whole book of Proverbs is about. It's practical discipleship, practical wisdom. But I think it's incredible that these things correspond to, you will have more hope if you forgive. That's profound.
Well, right. So again, we talk about increasing likelihood, right? So we think about how the world defines that, right? I got to get my kids in the right classes, and you need to take AP courses, and hey, you need to be participating in this sports team that's going to consume every aspect of your lives. Because why? Because it increases the likelihood of maybe you can find a career in this, or maybe, because our desire as parents is wanting our children to have at some level, a higher level of well-being than what we have. And we typically equate that to an education, to a better job. But I think what scripture says is something very different. If we want our children to have better well-being, then we need to increase the likelihood of that happening by understanding forgiveness or thankfulness or kindness. So it's not a leap, but the world doesn't say that, right?
Yeah.
So this is why Christian homes should look different. And that's why for us as parents, it's like, man, if I knew that, like I would have been all in about forgiveness if I knew that would benefit my children.
Yep.
And now that's why these conversations are so important.
Yep. Before we go to the next slide, let's share a personal thing. On Mother's Day, I had written just like a little thing, like, kind of shared about my wife and as a mother. And then I had another post, and I basically tagged and thanked probably 8 or 9 women in my life, including my mother, my mother-in-law, my sister-in-law, but then several women from our church. Like I said, you help us to parent our children. You're like additional mothers to my children, because you're helping them know what it means to follow Jesus and become human.
Well,
and that's the religious community part. Is it's not just relegated to my own local church, but it's the people that I follow Jesus with, and they help us so that my kids know what it means to forgive, be thankful, be kind, give, sacrifice, serve. So.
Well, and when we look at positive youth outcomes, so if we look at the research and data on positive youth outcomes, for parents, if you could find 3 or 4 other adults who share the same worldview than you do, and that doesn't mean it doesn't mean you're in lockstep of kind of groupthink, but if you have people you trust with your kids, if kids have 3 to 4 more other adults who, what you were just describing, it increases their likelihood of well-being in their life. Yep. So, I mean, it just validates what we believe is why the church is so important to human and child flourishing and thriving. We believe it is the answer, as we talked about this. What is the answer to human flourishing? It is the church. It truly is. Yep. Because of the generational impact. It is the people that are like-minded. Faith, it should really be instructing us in terms of this.
Yep.
That's why this conversation is so important.
Well, last couple of slides, we'll just kind of go through quickly here. So they get to more hard statistics, and it goes back to that Harvard study, which we mentioned a few weeks ago. We talked about the top part of that slide last week. Let's look at the bottom, the increased flourishing outcomes when a child is a part of a religious community. 47% more likely, children are 47% more likely to have a sense of mission and purpose. And from working in college ministry, Roy, you working in camp ministry, we know how much when children get to that, they get to that adolescent stage, and then high school, and then college, and they're like, what do I do with my life? I have no sense of purpose. So religious communities contribute to that positively. And then 38% are more likely to volunteer in their communities and be a part of things like Christian Heritage or other organizations that are trying to make, a positive change in the world. So, that's significant, because kids can grow up and they flounder and they're like, I don't know why I'm here. So I don't really have a sense of what I can contribute, because I don't even know me. And religious communities can help with that.
Agreed.
Let's go to the last.
I absolutely agree.
The last one here, religious upbringing also contributes toward a number of positive outcomes. We talked about this, but let's look at the percentages. 18% are more likely to have high levels of happiness. And then this one's huge. So let's go back to forgiveness. 87% of kids in that Harvard studied more likely to have high levels of forgiveness. So that just gives you some hard statistics for some things we were talking about.
And I think great validation. I think for us as parents, and again, why are we talking about this when we think about, obviously, I think people think about Christian Heritage strictly from a foster care lens or incarcerated family lens. Again, we've talked about this. Only 3 out of 10 youth right now in the U.S. are flourishing. There's a lot of other metrics that are highly concerning about social media use and technology and where culture is trending. And so all of these things. And so Christian Heritage, when we talk about human flourishing or child flourishing, is ultimately because we believe the church is the answer, that we can actually have a greater impact in our communities by mobilizing the church around these aspects of vulnerability. So it's important for us to kind of agree with the right things. This is why are you talking about this? Well, because it's about human flourishing. It's about discipleship. It's ultimately about advancing God's kingdom, not just for this next year, but it's about generational. How do we come alongside? So imagine those families who are not church are able to begin to understand the benefits of the church, understand the benefits of religious community, And we know that that can really help break the bonds of generational poverty in ways that no other institution in the U.S. can do. That is why, we'll keep hammering this, day after day, that's why we believe God's people are the answer to this.
And one quick encouragement, I think, to people who are listening, I've talked about this before in church contexts, pastoral contexts. We kind of talk about it a little bit as we work with churches as an organization, is helping people to belong before they believe. And when they belong to a religious community, specifically a Christian really community centered around Jesus, they will actually start to experience and see change, and they will have this sense of belonging. And then all of a sudden, they'll start to say, you know what? You live it out. I'm experiencing it. I think I do believe in Jesus. And for those listening, you've seen this with friends, right? You welcome them into your small group. You welcome them to the dinner table. You hung out with them. You met them on their terms, on their turf. You gave them a sense of belonging. And all of a sudden, they're like, man, they're becoming more joyful, more forgiving, more kind. And then one day they say, hey, you know what? I believe in Jesus now. It's a lot more powerful than just kind of sharing information or a booklet and saying, hey, here you go. I hope you believe in Jesus. No, you gave them that privilege to belong to a community. And then all of a sudden, transformation and change happen. And I think that's what the data, it proves that.
Well, and I love that, because at some level, you're now getting at the heart of foster care, right? I again, we've talked about, I think we can make a strong argument when we think about the national shortage of foster families, people looking to foster right now. There's a national shortage. There are lots of different threats that are, coming against foster care. And again, part of this is what you're talking about is, I think foster homes do this all the time, of creating a safe place of belonging for families. I mean, there are things, but if the family itself is not feeling that it has the means by which to not just care for itself, but someone else, I think this is why these conversations are really important, because we believe in the power of the benefits of these children being a part of our religious community. There are benefits to it. And so I think we're kind of navigating that, not just on a personal level, but the opportunity for anyone who's listening to say, you know what, can we really do this? I would say prayerfully consider how you could take your home, the stable home, the loving home that you have, and look at it possibly coming alongside a child that needs a place. And obviously, if you're not sure how to reach out or talk to someone, hey, you could reach out and talk to us about that. But I just absolutely love this idea of belonging and then belief. I think that is what Christian fostering brings to the table, that others who do not know Jesus do not bring to the table, because of all of the data we just talked about.
That's great. All right. Well, we're up for time.
Yeah.
Royce, good. I love doing these. This is so much fun. For those of you listening, and I hope you enjoy it, share it. Please do, so we can spread the word about what we're doing, what God is doing through us. But thanks for tuning in. We'll be back next week with another one.
Thanks, James.
Great. Have a great week, guys.